Eirik pressed his back against the twisted trunk, whispering,
If these trees had mouths, Runi, I think they would already be chewing on our bones.
Some stories are only whispered where the forests grow thick and the sky is little more than a rumor. This is one of them. Eirik and Runi entered the ancient woods searching for silver, old coins lost to time and blood and moss. They were not the first to try, but they may have been the last who dared. The deeper they pushed, the more the world changed around them. No birds, no wind. Only the hush of branches and the feeling of being watched. Most men who vanish in the wilds leave behind nothing but bones, if that. But the things Eirik and Runi found out there, the things that followed them, left scars that never faded. Eirik moved carefully, one hand always on his axe, the other gripping the leather strap of his pack. Runi walked just behind, his breath fogging in the cold air. Neither man spoke for a long time. There was a heaviness pressing in on them, a sense that the trees were listening to every footstep. The deeper they went, the stranger the woods became. The ground grew uneven, laced with twisted roots, slick with moss. Light barely touched the forest floor, and the shapes between the trees never seemed to hold still. Runi finally broke the silence.
Do you see that?
He whispered, nodding toward a stand of birch trees ahead. Eirik narrowed his eyes. There, among the white trunks, something pale seemed to move. It was gone as soon as he focused on it, like a shadow slipping behind the bark. He forced himself to keep walking.
Ignore it,
he said.
We did not come here to chase ghosts.
But both men picked up the pace, and behind them, the forest felt just a little bit closer. The path narrowed until it was nothing more than a break in the tangled undergrowth. Eirik hacked at the branches with his axe, the blade biting into wood that felt almost too soft beneath the edge. Each strike sent a faint shiver through the air, as if the trees resented every wound. Runi's lantern barely kept the shadows back. In the thin glow, twisted shapes clung to the edges of the light. Roots curled like fingers, clusters of mushrooms swollen and bruised. The deeper they pressed, the more it seemed the forest rearranged itself behind them, closing off any hope of a retreat. They came to a shallow hollow choked with fog. Runi hesitated at the edge, holding the lantern high.
Does it smell like smoke to you?
He asked, his voice trembling. Eirik sniffed the air. There was a burnt scent, bitter and cold, drifting through the mist. The ground was littered with blackened leaves, as if something had scorched the earth long ago.
Stay close. Keep your eyes up,
Eirik said, pushing ahead. A sound echoed through the hollow then, neither bird nor animal. A low, wet rasp, as if something deep in the woods was trying to breathe through waterlogged lungs. They pressed on through the fog, boots sinking into soil that felt loose and spongy. Every step seemed to echo, as if the earth beneath them was hollow and waiting for something to break through. Eirik kept his grip tight on the axe, his knuckles white. The forest felt more alive with each passing moment. Branches above nodded so thick that barely any light filtered through. The scent of burnt earth grew stronger, mixing with something metallic that stung the back of the throat. Runi kept glancing over his shoulder, his free hand tracing a charm around his neck. It was a small coin, worn smooth by years of anxious fingers. Eirik paused at the edge of a fallen log, scanning the trees ahead. Shapes shifted in the gloom. Sometimes they looked like men, sometimes like animals, but they never held their form long enough to be certain. The only true sound was the rasping breath that seemed to follow them just out of sight.
We should mark our way back,
Runi said suddenly, his voice tight.
so we do not lose ourselves in here.
Eirik nodded and dragged the blade of his axe along the side of a nearby tree. The bark parted too easily, sap oozing from the wound as if the forest itself was bleeding. Runi shuddered but said nothing. The trail ahead dipped into a narrow gully, shadows pooling thick along the bottom. As they descended, a cold breeze wound its way through the undergrowth, carrying with it a faint whisper. The words were not quite understandable, spoken in a tongue older than memory. For the first time since entering the forest, Eirik felt the prickle of fear crawl up his spine. The woods were watching, and whatever waited ahead was no longer content to hide. The gully swallowed them in darkness, the last scraps of daylight smothered by branches woven tight overhead. The ground here was slick and uneven, littered with half-rotted leaves and stones that shifted underfoot. Every breath tasted damp and old, heavy with the memory of things buried long ago. Runi moved closer to Eirik, his hand trembling on the lantern. The flame inside flickered, struggling against the wet, suffocating air. Somewhere nearby, a twig snapped sharply. Both men stopped in place, listening. Nothing moved, but the silence pressed in tighter, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Eirik pressed on, forcing himself forward even as his instincts screamed to turn back. The whispers grew clearer now, threading through the branches overhead. At times, it sounded almost like voices. A warning, maybe, or a curse. Sometimes he heard his own name carried on the wind, stretched thin and cold. They reached the heart of the gully, where the roots of the trees formed a tangled wall. There, half buried in mud, was something neither man expected. A cluster of coins, old and tarnished, lay scattered at the base of a massive tree. The silver gleamed dully in the lantern light, but the ground around it was dark with old stains. Runi knelt beside the coins, fingers shaking as he brushed away the dirt.
This is it.
He whispered, barely believing.
We found it.
Eirik watched the tree above them, noticing deep scars carved into the bark. The marks looked fresh, as if made by desperate hands. For a moment, he thought he saw movement inside the wounds, something pale shifting behind the wood, like an eye opening to watch them.
Take what you can,
Eirik said quietly, never looking away from the tree.
but do it quickly.
The forest was listening, and every moment they lingered felt borrowed. Runi scooped the coins into a cloth pouch, hands clumsy with excitement and fear. The silver was heavier than it should have been, each piece slick with grime and cold as ice. Eirik kept his gaze on the scarred trunk, every nerve on edge. The pale shape behind the bark seemed to swell and shift, pressing outward as if straining to escape. As soon as Runi tied off the pouch, the lantern sputtered violently. The light stretched long shadows across the gully, making the roots writhe and twist. Then, without warning, the flame snuffed out, plunging them into utter blackness. Runi cursed under his breath and fumbled with the lantern. Eirik stepped closer, listening. The whispers from the trees grew sharper, their meaning lost but the intent unmistakable. Somewhere above, branches creaked, bending under an invisible weight. A sudden, icy draft swept through the gully. The darkness shifted and thickened, swallowing the path they had come from. Eirik reached out, grabbing Runi's shoulder.
Stay close.
He said, his voice steady but low.
Do not run.
They pressed together, barely able to see, relying on the feel of the earth beneath their boots. The air grew colder, heavy with the stink of rot and old fire. Every direction felt wrong, the landscape twisting as if the forest itself was rearranging the world around them. A groan echoed from deep within the trees, so close it seemed to rise from the roots beneath their feet. Something massive, slow, and patient was moving just out of sight, circling them, always just out of reach. With no light left to guide them, Eirik and Runi pressed blindly forward, hearts thudding in their chests, knowing that if they stopped, whatever was following would finally close in. Stumbling through the dark, Eirik led the way by memory and touch alone. One hand pressed to the rough, wet bark of the trees, the other wrapped tight around the axe handle. Each step felt heavier, as if the ground itself wanted to hold them in place. The forest had grown silent again, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the hush of something waiting just outside the lantern's reach, breathing in time with their footsteps. Behind him, Runi muttered prayers under his breath, the pouch of coins clinking with each shaking step. They moved uphill, but the incline never seemed to end. The woods pressed tighter, branches snagging at their clothes and roots rising like traps beneath their feet. A pale shape flickered ahead, weaving between the trunks. Eirik stopped cold, heart pounding. He squinted, trying to focus, but it was already gone. In its place, claw marks scored the bark, fresh and deep, bleeding sap that glistened in the darkness. Suddenly, Runi stumbled and fell, vanishing from view with a strangled gasp. Eirik lunged after him, hands scraping across the ground, and found Runi caught in a snare of tangled roots. As Eirik pulled him free, he felt something cold brush his wrist, as if a hand made of mist and bone had reached from below. They scrambled up, backs pressed together, both men shaking. The whispers surged around them again, louder than before, almost forming words.
Eirik!
Something hissed from the dark, a voice neither man recognized but both understood. The forest was calling, and it was no longer content to let them leave in silence. The roots at their feet seemed to pulse, shifting with every heartbeat. Eirik felt the ground quiver beneath his boots, as if the earth itself wanted to swallow him whole. He pulled Runi upright, gripping his arm hard enough to leave bruises. Together, they staggered deeper into the trees, chasing the faintest hint of moonlight flickering through the branches far ahead. The air thickened, filled with the stink of damp leaves and old buried things. Every breath burned in their chests. The path twisted in ways that defied sense, doubling back and leading nowhere, always steering them farther from where they had come. Every few steps, Eirik glanced over his shoulder, certain he would see something pale and watching just behind them. Each time, there was nothing but the swaying branches, but the feeling never faded. Runi's lantern, now useless, clattered at his side. He clutched the pouch of coins close to his chest, knuckles white with fear.
This place is wrong.
He whispered, his voice thin and breaking.
We should never have come here.
Eirik tried to answer but found his throat too tight. He remembered the stories whispered by old men in smoky halls, warnings never to disturb what the forest hides. Now those warnings felt less like superstition and more like prophecy. A sharp cry split the silence, something distant but horribly close, more animal than human. It echoed through the trees, followed by a chorus of softer, answering voices. The sound made the hairs on Eirik's neck stand up. He tightened his grip on the axe, moving faster, willing his legs not to fail him. Somewhere behind them, the roots began to move in earnest, dragging themselves across the forest floor, hunting for the warmth of living flesh. The roots at their feet seemed to pulse, shifting with every heartbeat. Eirik felt the ground quiver beneath his boots, as if the earth itself wanted to swallow him whole. He pulled Runi upright, gripping his arm hard enough to leave bruises. Together, they staggered deeper into the trees, chasing the faintest hint of moonlight flickering through the branches far ahead. The air thickened, filled with the stink of damp leaves and old buried things. Every breath burned in their chests. The path twisted in ways that made no sense, doubling back and leading nowhere, always steering them farther from where they had come. Every few steps, Eirik glanced over his shoulder, certain he would see something pale and watching just behind them. Each time, there was nothing but the swaying branches, but the feeling never faded. Runi's lantern, now useless, clattered at his side. He clutched the pouch of coins close to his chest, his knuckles white with fear.
This place is wrong.
He whispered, his voice thin and breaking.
We should never have come here.
Eirik tried to answer but found his throat too tight. He remembered the stories whispered by old men in smoky halls, warnings never to disturb what the forest hides. Now those warnings felt less like superstition and more like prophecy. A sharp cry split the silence. Something distant but horribly close, more animal than human, echoed through the trees. It was followed by a chorus of softer, answering voices. The sound made the hairs on Erik's neck stand up. He tightened his grip on the axe, moving faster, willing his legs not to fail him. Somewhere behind them, the roots began to move in earnest, dragging themselves across the forest floor and hunting for the warmth of living flesh. The forest closed in behind them, sealing off the path they had come from. Eirik and Runi ran without looking back, the ground buckling beneath their feet and roots grasping at their ankles with every step. The pale faces in the trees watched them go, silent now, their eyes tracking every desperate movement. The night air was thick and cold, heavy with the stink of sap and old earth. Their breaths came ragged, each one tasting of rot and panic. Runi stumbled, nearly falling, but Eirik dragged him up and forced them forward. The pouch of coins clattered against Runi's chest, a final reminder of why they had entered the woods at all. Now it felt like a curse, every coin colder than ice. Ahead, a thin line of gray light appeared. It was the dawn, cold and distant, barely piercing the tangled branches. The men pushed toward it, ignoring the pain in their legs and the burning in their lungs. The roots still tried to hold them back, but each step brought more resistance, as if the forest itself could sense that they were slipping from its grasp. At last, they broke through the tree line and stumbled out into the open, falling hard onto frostbitten grass. Behind them, the forest waited in silence, every branch motionless, every face in the bark fading back into the wood. The trees stood quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. Eirik and Runi lay there, gasping in the new morning light, clutching the cursed coins and listening to the silence. They had survived the hunger of the old forest, but neither man would ever return. Some scars, Eirik would come to learn, never truly fade, and there are places where the past is buried for a reason. If this story left you with a chill you can't quite shake, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss one of Eirik's stories. And tell me, would you risk the old forest for a handful of silver, or would you trust your gut and turn back? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching Cabin of Whispers. See you next time.